Citizens in the small village of Salem were being accused of casting spells, of consorting with the devil, of being witches. This persecution was a relatively new phenomenon in America, but across France, Italy, Germany, and England, massive witch hunts had been going on for 300 years. From the 14th through the 16th centuries, an estimated 40 to 50,000 people were executed. The religious impetus for this human devastation came from the Holy Scriptures.
What is written in the Bible is the Word of God. It is inviolable, it is infallible, and we have to live by it on a daily basis. And when you read in the book of Exodus, chapter 22, verse 18, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." There it is.
Despite the biblical condemnation, early Christians were relatively tolerant of paganism and witchcraft. But as the Roman Catholic Church began to consolidate its power, heretics were looked on as enemies. By 1231, Pope Gregory IX instituted the Inquisition in order to expose and punish heresy. From this point on, attitudes towards witchcraft took a decidedly violent turn. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII declared witchcraft a heresy. The punishment was death. Witch hunts were often conducted by superstitious villagers. As animosities and tensions rose amongst them, the villagers used the witch hunt as a convenient and powerful tool to get rid of their imagined or real enemies. And the authorities did very little to stop them.
Let's make it plain what a witch hunt actually means. It doesn't mean that people in hoods go around knocking on doors and asking for any witches there. It means that unusually the authorities actually encourage local people to be afraid of each other and to denounce each other as witches. It's both a purging of the local community by itself and a hysteria whipped up by people who ought to have known better, people in charge.
Once a person was accused of being a witch, it was still necessary to provide concrete evidence before prosecution. But how do you prove that a spell or curse has been cast? What the authorities needed were other, more tangible signs of witchcraft. In 1486, a guidebook on finding witches called the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of the Witches, was published. It provided a definition of witchcraft as well as rules on how to investigate, try, and judge cases. The book stated that one sure sign of a witch was the devil's mark or witch's teats. Looking for the devil's mark became a very popular pastime and may have served more prurient interests than the health and welfare of the community. It involved a careful inspection of the suspected witch's body, which could only be accomplished after shaving all of his or her hair, including the genital area.
It's an old folk tradition, based on the idea that the devil, making a pact with a witch, leaves a special mark, which in turn based on an even older tradition that witches have teats, through which they suckle their familiar spirits, the animal spirits that serve them. And the idea is that if you can find these marks, these teats, you've proved the person's a witch.
They would then test that mark by piercing it with a needle or pin. If pain was felt, or if blood was drawn from the mark, there was no evidence there to indicate that this person might be a witch. On the other hand, if after probing with a needle or a pin and they find that there is no pain and there is no blood, it is not normal, it is not natural, it is unnatural, then there is evidence in their view that this might in fact be a witch's mark.
Another popular method in the Middle Ages was called swimming a witch. The theory was that water being pure would reject all evil. The belief was that a witch would float and an innocent person would sink. The test always provided a victim. The Malleus Maleficarum also encouraged torture as a way to elicit a confession from a suspected witch.
The best way of obtaining a confession is to apply force, best in purely brutal, practical terms. The most effective actual method used was known as the strappado. It's a bit like having your arm twisted behind your back in a school playground, except it goes on for hours. Now, the reason why this was used is that it's excruciatingly painful. It's horrible.
Torturing suspected witches was justified in the eyes of the law. English magistrates considered the practice of witchcraft a crime against the church and the state.
From the days of Henry VIII onward, the king is the head of the church. So your political leader is also the head of the Church of England, and for this reason, when you turn your back upon God and upon the church, you are very much also turning your back upon your king.
Witchcraft was therefore considered an act of treason and a capital offense. Witch hunts continued unabated through the 17th century. Neighbors accused neighbors. Thousands of innocent lives were lost. In 1629, King Charles I of England granted a religious splinter group called the Puritans a charter to settle and govern an English colony in the Massachusetts Bay. Their desire? To create a new, perfect society based on the principles of the Bible, a theocracy with no separation of church and state.
Their goal was a kind of model community, what they called a city on a hill, that would be a kind of light to people all over the world. I mean, we still have that notion of the U.S. with us today, but it was very intense in those early years.
Not everyone who crossed over was a Puritan.
Others leave because they have no land, because they have no jobs, because their lives in England are so difficult that going to the edge of the known world and building a society out of nothing sounds better. One of the things that eventually produces a natural kind of tension in many New England communities, and indeed in many colonial communities, is you have people who are there for different reasons.
The Puritans remained British citizens, and like their countrymen, they were also a community that very much believed that witches existed.
You have to understand witchcraft, particularly in of their larger belief system midst.
Satan was real. Satan and his forces were around us in an invisible world, and we're always watching, we're always looking for an opportunity to have an effect for evil upon the godly community, always attempting to break down the godly way of life and to discredit the godly community before the unbelieving world.
Little wonder that in this highly charged environment, the Puritans engaged in witch hunts, just as they had in England. But the first witch trial in Massachusetts was not in Salem. It was in Charlestown in 1648. A midwife and healer named Margaret Jones was accused of witchcraft. Villagers believed that she had a malignant touch that could cause deafness and nausea. Jones was supposed to be able to foretell the future and even had a witch's teat. She was hanged in 1648. Other cases followed, but it would be 40 years before a witch trial would capture widespread public attention. In 1688, 4 Boston children were presumably possessed by Goodwife Glover, the mother of their family servant. Eventually, the children were cured through prayer and fasting, and Goodwife Glover, the witch, was executed. The investigator was Cotton Mather, a prominent Boston minister. He described incantation as believed to have had a profound effect on the people of Salem, and the unique circumstances surrounding Salem Village in 1692 made it particularly vulnerable to a witch hunt of its own. About 500 people lived in Salem Village, the outlying farming community of Salem Town, a thriving seaport. Although only 6 miles from the coast, it was considered a wilderness settlement.
It isn't a settled, a civilized, sophisticated community. It's a community that's on the outskirts, and they're just hanging on by their fingernails.
In addition to their everyday hardships, the Puritans lived in fear of the forest's dangers. The woods could easily conceal an Indian raid or the devil himself. himself. The Puritans had other words. The charter granting them independence from the crown and the right to own land was revoked in 1684. Although the charter was restored 5 years later when King James II was deposed, the political instability took its toll on Salem's residents. Further anxiety was apparent in everyday life because of their rigid religious practices.
I think for people in the 20th century, Puritan belief would be an incredibly difficult religion to follow because it's a religion of endless striving and very uncertain reward.
The Puritans believed that every person's fate is predetermined by God before he or she is born. They searched for clues to reveal whether they were a member of the elect and would go to heaven, or be damned to hell.
You're constantly searching yourself for signs that you can't read. Does the fact that I am sinning in this particular way mean that I am predestined for hell? Maybe. Does the fact that I am pious and doing all the things that the minister tells me in church mean that I have had an experience of indwelling grace and I'm one of God's chosen people? Maybe. How can we sense God's pleasure or displeasure? That anxiety goes right to the core of Puritanism.
Also at the core of Puritanism was an inherent misogyny. Puritan women were expected to be silent, docile helpmates to their husbands, and mothers to their children.
Puritans had an ideal for women, and that ideal had a number of characteristics. I mean, a woman was expected to be submissive to her husband.
Him outside, she within. Him in public, she at home. Him speaking, she listening. Him preaching, she hearing.
Puritans believed that just by her very nature, a woman was more likely than a man to enlist in the devil's service.
Women were not allowed to be ministers, so they were more likely to join the devil's cause and preach for his cause. There were 2 monks that presumed that women were naturally lustful, and that they were interested in, sexual relations with the devil, and that's why they joined the devil's forces. Other people argued that women were, they wanted certain kinds of knowledge, like Eve in the Garden of Eden, that they were constantly sought out things they weren't supposed to know about, and that led them to the devil.
The climate of suspicion that surrounded women was further exacerbated by the social dynamics of everyday life in Salem.
There's a kind of hothouse atmosphere to these small communities where you are what your neighbors say about you, and they're saying it back and forth in the same small towns over and over again, over generations.
Bitter land disputes between families in Salem erupted continually. Villagers also resented being under the political domain of Salem town. The conservative farmers in the village often fought with the more liberal merchants who dominated Salem town. When In Search of History returns, all these tensions ripping Salem village apart sparked the witch hunt of 1692. Elsewhere in the world in 1692, in London, Aesop's Fables was published. German mathematician Gottfried von Leibniz invented a calculating machine which multiplied and divided. And a major earthquake hit Jamaica, causing 2/3 of Port Royal, a pirate city, to fall into the sea along with fortunes in stolen booty. Simmering tensions, bitter disputes, and religious fervor in Salem village proved a deadly combination, setting the stage for the witch hunt of 1692. Since then, historians, sociologists, and psychologists have sifted through letters, diaries, and testimonies to give meaning and perspective to one of the most traumatic events of colonial America.
There are over 500 surviving documents from the Salem witchcraft trials of 1692. They reflect about 160 cases, roughly, of witchcraft accusations during the year 1692. And they consist of warrants, indictments, a lot of depositions against various people, a few death warrants.
But surprisingly, there are no transcripts of the actual trials. experts have pieced together the events leading up to the trials from other existing documents. It is believed that it all started in Salem Village, in the kitchen of the Reverend Samuel Parris.
When the winter of 1691-92 comes along, Reverend Parris and his wife are spending a good deal of their time, as any minister and his wife would have been doing, visiting the members of their parish.
Their daughter, Elizabeth Parris, aged 9, and her 11-year-old cousin, Abigail Williams, were left in the care of a Carib Indian slave named Tituba. Tituba warmed the cold New England nights by reminiscing about her childhood in Barbados. She told fanciful tales involving magic and power. As the winter wore on, Tituba grew bolder. She demonstrated voodoo tricks for the girls.
Tituba takes an egg white and suspends it in a glass of water and then holds it up to a candle and says, "Now if you look, you will see there the image of your future husband."
Despite their young age, the girls knew this type of behavior was strictly forbidden. They managed to keep it a secret for a while.
Needless to say, with fascinating little stories like this, the group begins to grow. And it includes 6 other young girls within a very short time.
Ranging in age from 12 to 20, those listening to Tituba's stories included Ann Putnam Jr., Mary Walcott, Elizabeth Hubbard, Elizabeth Booth, Mercy Lewis, and Mary Warren. The lurid tales stirred excitement but also guilt in the young Puritans. They began to act in strange and aberrant ways.
They fell into these fits. They had certain kinds of trance experiences. They felt prickled with pins and cut with knives. They were tempted to throw themselves into the fire, to commit suicide. They couldn't. They had to stop their ears when the minister preached the word of God. They couldn't listen to it.
They're screaming. They're crying out. They are throwing things about the room. This sort of behavior is not the behavior of young Christian girls, certainly not in a Puritan community.
Alarmed, the Reverend Parris called in the village physician, Dr. William Griggs, who found no physical symptoms to explain their unusual behavior and concluded that the cause must be spiritual. He declared the girls were under the evil hand of witchcraft. Given the Puritan belief in witches, the diagnosis was readily accepted.
Puritans believed that witches could in fact seduce or tempt people to become witches themselves. And so they saw this behavior, these convulsions, this stuff, as a reaction against the witch. In other words, the idea was these young people were perceived as struggling not to become witches themselves.
Parris began to question the girls relentlessly to identify the witch who had afflicted them. Finally, Elizabeth and Abigail named Tituba, who lived with them and had regaled the girls with her stories and magic.
With her status as a slave, she's an obvious choice to be accused of witchcraft. She has absolutely no one who's going to stand up for her.
But it did not end there. Next, the girls accused Sarah Good, the town beggar. Sarah Good's stooped and wrinkled appearance, her irascible temper, and her low status in the village made her an easy target. And then another accusation, Sarah Osborne, an old and bedridden Salem villager. Already a marked woman, she was scorned for marrying her indentured servant, John Osborne. She also shared one noticeable trait with accused witch Sarah Good. Neither of them attended church. On March 1st, 1692, the 3 women were brought before an informal tribunal in the meeting house of Salem Village in order to establish whether there was any evidence of witchcraft. Magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin presided.
You don't have the layer of interplay between lawyers that you have today as opposed to in 1692. It seemed to be much more just straight depositions from those accusing someone of a crime of some sort, in this case witchcraft, and the accused trying to defend themselves when being verbally examined in the court by the judges.
The magistrate's decisions on the kinds of evidence allowed in this informal proceeding also played an important role in the trials to come.
The whole purpose of the pre-trial examination was to determine, on the part of the court, if there was sufficient evidence, serious evidence, weighty evidence, admissible evidence, perhaps submitted by more than two people, that this individual was in fact a likely suspect, that there was enough evidence that we might proceed and have a trial.
Suddenly in Salem, magistrates and ministers who are advising them are willing to accept kinds of evidence that they would have considered unacceptable in most other witchcraft proceedings that we know of in New England.
Perhaps the most damaging decision of all was to allow spectral evidence.
Spectral evidence in 1692 was evidence that the accused appeared to the persons being tormented in the form of a specter. Sometimes it would take the shape of a bird, or sometimes it would be the specter of the person. But it would not be the actual person who would be accused of hitting or pinching or biting someone being tormented. It would be their specter that was doing it. And so the specter is evident only to the person making the accusation. The specter is not evident to the person who's being accused. It's not evident to the spectators in the court. It's not evident to the judges. It's only evident to the person making the accusation.
The preliminary hearing began with the interrogation of Sarah Good. In a deposition taken a few days before the hearing, Ann Putnam Jr. swore that the specter of Sarah Good had tried to enlist her as a witch by getting her to sign the Devil's Book.
I saw the apparition of Sarah Good, which did torture me grievously. She did prick me and pinch me most grievously, and also since, several times urging me vehemently to write in her book.
Several of the other girls confirmed Ann's accusations. Magistrate John Hathorne questioned Sarah Good, who repeatedly denied being a witch.
Sarah Good, what evil spirit have you familiarity with?
None.
Have you made no contract with the devil?
No.
Why do you hurt these children?
I do not hurt them. I scorn it.
Who do you employ then to do it?
I employ nobody.
What creature do you employ then?
No creature. But I am falsely accused.
Each denial was met with convulsive fits and unearthly screams from the afflicted girls, who claimed that Sarah Good's specter had attacked them in the courtroom. This was perceived as strong evidence of their guilt. Sarah Osborne's questioning was met with the same histrionics from the girls. But it would be the testimony of the third accused woman, Tituba, that would change the course of the trials.
She immediately confesses to witchcraft. I think it's fairly clear from her examination. I think she's simply going to tell these officials whatever it is that she thinks they want to hear.
Finally, after who knows how long amount of questions and badgering, she finally says, "The devil came to me and bid me serve him."
For 3 days, Tituba spun elaborate tales about talking animals, night flights on broomsticks, and spectral visits intended to harm the children. Most significantly, she testified that a mysterious tall man from Boston bade her to sign the Devil's Book in blood. When Tituba was asked how many names were in the book, she replied 9, her own, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne's, and 6 others that she could not see. This statement sent a shiver through the crowd in the meeting house. It meant there were other witches in the hallowed community of Salem. The confession of Tituba the slave to the charges of witchcraft rocked Salem in March 1692. Her statement that 9 people had signed the Devil's Book was a Puritan Pandora's box. The paranoia that ensued set neighbor against neighbor in the small community.
We have this traitor to God's community living in our midst. And the question, of course, would be, how many others? If she could live with a minister and his wife and family, How many others of this kind might there be in this community? And that is the great fear.
It seems like there's just witches everywhere, and you're thinking, well, that woman who lives down the road that we've never liked terribly much. I mean, she does seem a little odd. Is she a witch?
In this poisoned atmosphere, the accusations of witchcraft began to spread. But there was a marked difference in the new wave of accusations. The first accused women had been of low status in the village. Those who followed were upstanding members of the community. For example, matronly Rebecca Nurse harbored the alleged witch.
She was an elderly woman. She was 70 or 71, rather infirm and very deaf. When she was accused of witchcraft, I think that must have sent a few shudders through the community, because she is not an obvious person to be accused of witchcraft.
Rebecca Nurse's reaction to her accusation was typical of the guilt-ridden Puritan mentality. When asked if she was guilty of the crime of witchcraft, Nurse replied,
As to this thing, I am innocent as the child unborn. But surely what sin has God found in me unrepented of, that he would lay such an affliction on me in my old age?
The arrest of Rebecca Nurse reflected a pronounced split in Salem. In fact, most of those who supported Nurse lived in the East, held more liberal views, and were more prosperous than their neighbors. In general, the accusers were poor farmers of lower status and lived in the western part of the village. 39 people signed a petition attesting to Rebecca Nurse's moral character.
When you signed a petition for someone who'd been accused of witchcraft, you're putting your own neck on the line to a certain extent, because you didn't know when accusations might be start being made against you.
By spring 1692, the number of accusations escalated. More than 100 men and women from Salem to Boston were arrested. Even relatives of the accused witches became targets. The youngest, 4-year-old Dorcas Good, the daughter of Sarah Good.
They actually had to make a special set of chains for her. She was so small that her arms and feet, of course, just slid right out of the normal-sized chains that were used to chain people up.
It is widely believed that Dorcas confessed in order to be with her mother in prison. Both of Rebecca Nurse's sisters, Mary Easty and Sarah Town Corris, soon joined her in jail. Just about anybody who spoke out against the proceedings was immediately suspect. Even Reverend George Burroughs, the former minister of Salem Village, who lived in Maine, was held for trial. As the ranks of the accused continued to swell, it became clear that something needed to be done about the situation in Salem. The witch hunt formally moved from a series of inquiries, statements, and depositions against suspected witches to official trial. On June 2, 1692, Massachusetts Governor William Phips officially convened the Court of Oyer and Terminer at Salem. Translated as to hear and determine, the court, made up of 7 judges and 12 jurors, was presided over by the Deputy Governor of Massachusetts, William Stoughton. The first person called before the court, a woman named Bridget Bishop.
She was a property owner. She had been married several times. She was very prominent in her business activities. She was independent, a very independent thinker.
But the biggest strike against Bridget Bishop was that she had been accused of witchcraft in the past.
Samuel Willard, a Puritan minister, says that there is no crime or aspersion that is with more difficulty wiped off than an accusation of witchcraft. So I think any woman accused of witchcraft would have known that word being used against her was going to have enduring force.
The court found Bridget Bishop guilty. Tried on June 2nd, she was hanged 8 days later at Gallows Hill in Salem, the first victim of the witch trials. The trials were largely a repetition of the preliminary hearings of March and April 1692. The testimony as well as the spectral evidence gathered during the proceedings were accepted as fact by the judges. As news of the event spread throughout New England, the girls continued to react to the testimony in increasingly dramatic ways.
If the accused moved a certain way, if they moved their head a certain way, the girls immediately, all their heads would move the same way. If they threw up their hands or rolled their eyeballs, the same thing with the girls would throw up their hands and roll their eyeballs. And so the pressure is on, finally, for these people to essentially confess to witchcraft, because, of course, the minute they do that, the girls are fine.
Ironically, a confession of witchcraft was the one sure way to survive the trials. In Puritan society, a confession put a person in the hands of God. It was up to the Lord to forgive sins and cleanse the unrighteous. 55 of the approximately 200 accused took this way out. But the girls showed no sign of ending their finger-pointing. In fact, they began to spread their accusations beyond the confines of Salem to Gloucester, Beverly, Lynn, Malden, Amesbury, Billerica, Marblehead, Boston, Charlestown, and Andover.
I think their accusations are also fed as the trials move forward by the unexpected attention that's paid to them. They're in a position suddenly that's very unusual for young women to be in Puritan society, which is they're the public testifiers. All of a sudden, the preachers and the magistrates are the listeners, and the young women are the speakers. It's absolutely unprecedented. Their words are being reported up and down the colonies as far away as London. I mean, these women are rock star famous in their own time.
Unchecked by the authorities, the words of the girls sent more and more people to their deaths. On July 19, 1692, 5 women, including Sarah Good and Rebecca Nurse, were hanged. Sarah cursed Judge Nicholas Noyes as she was led to her death.
I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink.
Sarah's curse may have come true. 25 years later, as Noyes lay dying, he apparently choked on his own blood. On August 9th, 5 more people, including Reverend George Burroughs, were put to death on Gallows Hill.
Reverend George Burroughs stood straight as an arrow, faced his accusers, and as many people are aware, recited the Lord's Prayer from beginning to end, letter perfect.
Witches were supposed to be unable to say the prayer properly. Burroughs' final act may have planted a seed of doubt in the minds of Salem's residents. Nevertheless, on September 22nd, another 8 people were hanged. They were the last people to die, but the terror was far from over. During the course of the Salem witch trials, more than 200 people were accused, and 24 lost their lives. Contrary to popular belief, no one was burned at the stake. English law had forbidden the practice of burning witches almost 150 years earlier. Of those who died, 19 were hanged, 4 died in prison, and one man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death. He refused to enter a plea of either innocent or guilty, knowing that the court could not proceed without it. Following an English tradition, large stones were placed on him in order to press the truth out of him.
They placed a rock on the board, and they asked him, "Are you guilty or innocent?" He says nothing. They continue to pile rock after rock, until finally, toward the very end, all he says is more weight. They comply with his request, and his chest is broken.
But death was not even the final judgment rendered upon the accused witches.
Convicted witches, of course, would be expelled from the church, so they would not be allowed to be buried in any kind of holy cemetery or consecrated land. These people were clearly considered total pariahs. The bodies would be cut down and buried in very shallow graves, and everyone would disperse. And in fact, it's almost as if they've been wiped from the face of the earth. If you look at the published vital records of this period, their deaths are not recorded. It's as if they weren't there.
As the leaves began to change in the fall of 1692, so finally did attitudes towards the girls who started it all. Their denunciations had become too outrageous for even the authorities to support.
They begin to accuse people who are not thought of as witches, men, children, the upper classes in the community, ministers. Once that happens, there's real resistance to what they called spectral sight.
Rumors began to circulate that the wives of Reverend Increase Mather and Governor Phipps were about to be accused of witchcraft. This time, the girls had gone too far. Governor Phipps dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer on October 29th and moved the cases to a superior court in late November. Spectral evidence, which had damned all of the witch hunt's victims in the past, was not allowed, due in part to Increase Mather, the father of Cotton Mather. He wrote,
"It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned."
As a result, 49 of the 52 remaining prisoners were acquitted and released from prison. 3 remained there until the spring of 1693. Tituba was sold back into slavery to pay for their expenses. 5 years passed before the Salem community began to recognize its grievous mistakes. On January 16, 1697, a day of public fasting was held at Salem to ask God's forgiveness for past sins. Judge Samuel Sewell and the 12 jurors who had condemned all of the alleged witches to death signed a petition, a public show of repentance. In 1702, a modest inquiry into the nature of witchcraft was published by Reverend John Hale. The book includes one of the most famous and poignant apologies for the trials.
Such was the darkness of that day, the tortures and lamentations of the afflicted, and the power of former precedents, that we walked in clouds and could not see our way.
In 1706, Ann Putnam Jr., one of the most vocal of the accusing girls, faced her peers in the church at Salem Village. Now 26, Anne blamed the devil for having deluded her and causing her to take innocent lives. She was the only accuser ever to apologize for her actions. In 1711, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts reversed the verdicts on 22 of the 31 people convicted of witchcraft, exonerating them and restoring their civil rights. The state paid £600 British in restitution to the survivors of the trials and their families. It would not be until 1957 that the guilty sentence on the remaining 9 people was reversed. Exoneration and public apology does not erase the hysteria or the question, why did the girls claim that witches afflicted them? Were they acting, or did they genuinely believe what they were saying? For the last 250 years, the predominant opinion has been that the girls were making it all up.
They were doing what they were doing for sport, that this was a way for these girls who grew up in a very strict society. They were young women who were sort of on the bottom of the social scale for a while, gained attention for themselves, made themselves the focus of the community, actually wielded tremendous power, and had a great deal of fun doing it.
Since the 1960s, there are new schools of thought.
My sense is that most of them genuinely believed they were possessed. And when they went about accusing people, they tended to accuse people that already, at least according to their parents, were people who had a reputation for witchcraft in the community.
Another theory is that some members of Salem Village may have stood to profit by accusing their neighbors of witchcraft.
The conviction that this crime of witchcraft brings with it isn't just simply your personal death, your own personal demise. It also was the demise of your family fortune, because as a convicted felon, as a capital offender, your property then becomes the property of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It's forfeit, and then it is sold at public auction.
We will never know what was in the minds of the afflicted girls and the people of Salem, but the events had a profound impact on our notions of justice in America.
We never again assume that people are guilty until proven innocent. The American system develops with the belief that people are innocent until proven guilty, and that change that takes place, that divergence from the Old English common law theory, takes place after the Salem witchcraft episode.
The Salem witch trials have left their mark on American history, denoting a time when fear and hysteria replaced reason and good judgment. It wouldn't be the last time that America or the world would be caught up in the nightmare of a witch hunt, where one group is vilified and persecuted to allay the irrational fears of another. The lesson is one that seems doomed to be repeated, as we discover in Search of History.
On a summer's day in 1553, after 10 days of travelling, a magnificent procession reached the capital. At its head was Mary Tudor, the eldest daughter of King Henry VIII. She had come to claim her inheritance, the crown of England. Mary entered the City of London in triumph on the 3rd of August, 1553. The buildings of the city that Mary knew have disappeared almost completely, but its boundaries are the same as the modern City of London's financial district you see behind me. Mary entered from the east at Aldgate, and she rode through streets hung with precious tapestries to the Tower of London. The people wept tears of joy, and Mary quoted ecstatically from the Bible, "If God be with us, who can be against us?" This day was Mary's victory over all those who had opposed her, but the joyful scenes were not to last. Mary was a queen driven by conscience and by faith. She would send hundreds of her subjects to burn at the stake for what she believed was right, a vision of England restored to its traditional Catholic faith. Mary was born on the 18th of February, 1516, at Greenwich Palace, besides the River Thames. She was given a splendid christening, and the bells rang for joy. The Princess Mary was an extraordinarily important child. Her parents, Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, had already been married for 7 years when she was born, and they'd had several children. But all the other children were either stillborn or they died shortly after birth. Mary was the first child to survive. This meant that she was heir to the crown of England. There was only one drawback. Mary was a girl, and a woman had never ruled England as queen. Mary's destiny seemed clear. She was a royal princess who would become a royal bride and only reign as her husband's wife. The search for the right husband started early.
Benedicat vos, omnipotens Deus, Pater et Filius et Spiritus Sanctus. Amen.
When Mary was only 2, she was betrothed to the Dauphin, the heir to the throne of France, in a ceremony which mimicked all the features of a real wedding. This was just the first of many engagements. Over the next 10 years, the promise of Mary's hand in marriage was repeatedly used to make treaties with other countries. As daughter of King Henry and heir to England, Mary was an attractive proposition. But her mother's family was even grander. Catherine of Aragon was descended from the great Spanish royal family, whose empire now stretched across most of Europe and even to the New World of America. Catherine made sure that Mary did not forget her Spanish roots. Mary spoke Spanish as well as English and proudly identified herself with her Spanish family. After her father, the king, Mary was treated as the most important person in England. She liked music, dancing, and games. Henry referred to her as his pearl in the world. Catherine, too, was devoted to Mary and was fiercely ambitious for her daughter. She made sure that Mary's education would fit her for her destiny, however great it might be. This letter was written by Catherine to Mary when she was aged 8 or 9. As for your writing in Latin, I am glad that ye shall change from me to Master Featherstone. Catherine had begun by teaching Mary Latin herself, but now she was to change to a professional tutor.
Extend your storage space. If you buy a house to use for storage, I'll give you some more.
Latin was a masculine subject. Catherine is determined that Mary shall have good Latin to fit her for that most masculine of roles, rulership. Henry still had no other heir, and Catherine was preparing Mary for the possibility that she might one day be Queen of England in her own right. Age 9, Mary came here to Ludlow to take up residence as the nominal head of the government of Wales. It was a highly symbolic move. For the last 50 years, every Prince of Wales had come here to Ludlow to complete his education and to learn the business of ruling. And the fact that Mary, though a woman, was following in their footsteps showed that her father still regarded her as heir of England. For the next 3 years, Mary spent much time at Ludlow as Princess of Wales, but the search for the right husband continued. Aged 11, she was to be inspected for a new French match. Mary was only a year away from the minimum age of marriage, and her future as both a queen and a royal bride seemed assured. But before the year was up, disaster struck. In 1528, Mary left Ludlow for the last time. She returned to a court in turmoil, for her father had decided to divorce her mother. Catherine had grown fat and ugly, and Henry had fallen passionately in love with Anne Boleyn. For the next 5 years, Henry searched for a way to marry Anne, but the Pope would not allow him to divorce Catherine. Eventually, a cleric, Thomas Cranmer, came up with a solution. As Archbishop of Canterbury, he would be prepared to divorce Henry and Catherine in defiance of the Pope. Mary would never forget or forgive what Cranmer had done. Her childhood was over, and in 1533, when Mary was 17, her father finally married his mistress. A few months later, Anne gave birth to a baby girl, Elizabeth, who was proclaimed Princess of Wales. There were now 2 queens and 2 princesses in England. Henry and Anne could not sleep easy until Catherine was compelled to renounce her title of Queen and Mary to give up hers of Princess. By the time Elizabeth was born, Mary was a young woman. She had to endure the humiliation of being sent to live at Hatfield as a servant to the baby Elizabeth, around whom now everything revolved. Mary was stripped of her royal title and declared